Right. Well, welcome for our discussion today. We're competing with lunch, but thank you for coming. I think competing with lunch is a noble thing to do because I think we're here to talk about some of the most important matters that define the world that we live in today and where we're going. So thank you for sparing your sandwich for us. Just a quick introduction. My name's Jonathan Maxwell. I'm the author of this new book, The Edge, which is about energy, climate, and conflict, and joined today by Ed Conway. You might wish to introduce yourself, Ed.
So I'm Ed Conway. Hello, everyone. I cover economics for Sky News, but I've written this book called Material World, which I can blather about later on.
Just before we get started, I said I thought we were here to talk about some of the most important issues that are facing us today. But just to sort of test that out, see if you agree, there are three things I'm going to ask you questions about quickly. One of which is, do people in this room think that climate change is very serious?
Yes.
Maybe hands, show of hands, I think. Oh, okay. That's quite a large number. Do people in this room think that energy security is a serious problem? Okay. And do people in this room think that energy costs matter? Okay, so I think we're going to have a relevant conversation, Ed.
Yeah.
In that case, that's good. So look, I'm going to kick off. We'll get into some of those points as we go along here. But Ed, I'm going to start with a really important, obvious question. What's your book about, and why did you write it?
Thank you, Jonathan. I've written this book called Material World, and I guess the starting point for this is, so I cover economics for Sky News, and I realised quite recently that in all, I guess, a lot of what I do, in a lot of what I cover, I'm actually kind of inhabiting this slightly surreal existence where we think that all that matters is the kind of intangible things in our lives. You know, we work in services, in my case, very much in services. I don't understand how things are made. I don't make anything. I trade in ideas, and a lot of us now do. And we kind of assume, I think, and I kind of assumed, that to some extent we have dematerialized the world, that physical stuff just doesn't matter as much as it used to. And part of the kind of thesis of this book is that it matters enormously, that it's massively underrated, and that to some extent we've kind of forgotten the importance of it. And by forgetting the importance of it, and this kind of brings us back to the energy transition. I mean, this is not, it's not a political book. In some, you know, it wasn't intended to be a political book. It wasn't really supposed to be about the present moment we're in right now, but it just so happens that a lot of what we're going through right now is really relevant to that. Because we haven't really thought about the fundamental underpinnings of this world, that when you communicate with the internet, for instance, on the internet, it's not just something going off into space. You are communicating along fiber optics, physical fiber optics made of glass, which is made of sand. You're communicating via data centers where you have circuitry that is made of silicon that comes out of the ground. You're communicating on servers through electronics with copper that comes out of the ground. Everything you touch on a daily basis begins somewhere. And because we have somewhat forgotten where those things begin, where they come out of the ground, what you do to them to turn them into the amazing things that you have in your pocket, whether it's your phone or whether it's something else, because I feel we haven't thought enough about that as a society over the last few decades, because we're kind of doing less of it, because we've offshored a lot of it to China and to other places, I think we have a bit of a problem at the moment. And that problem is that we've just committed ourselves, as we all know, to something very important. We've committed ourselves to net zero, to eliminating carbon emissions. It is one of the biggest goals that humankind, if not the biggest, that humankind has ever set itself. You know, we're trying. Every previous energy transition has involved us going up a thermodynamic ladder. So what we've done is we've gone from ever kind of less dense to ever more dense sources of energy. So we went from wood to coal, from coal to oil, from oil to gas to nuclear and so on. We've gone up a ladder. But this, in committing to what we're committing to do now, we are for the most part, there's still nuclear, but for the most part we are going from pretty high energy dense things to low energy dense things like trying to get your energy and your power from wind turbines and from solar and then taking that and putting it into batteries. That's a massive challenge. The second part that is incredibly difficult is we're trying to do that in a compressed space of time, a more compressed space of time than we have ever done before. So we've set ourselves this massive challenge. And I just worry that because our fundamental understandings of how this world that we inhabit actually got here, where did your phone come from? Where did the kind of chemicals in your, that you use to clean your house come from? Where do the metals that go in the wires behind the walls come from? Because we've kind of somewhat as a society forgotten about that stuff and we just buy it in from overseas, I think we miss the scale of what we are facing right now. And so my kind of overarching feel is in order to understand what we're heading for in the future, let's start by understanding where we are right now and how we build this world that we inhabit. And we can talk a little bit about kind of what that involves. So that's kind of the thesis of the book. But the reason I'm kind of really excited to be talking to Jonathan here is that Jonathan, whereas I'm a journalist, I just write, and I kind of think Jonathan is a doer. He's been in this world for longer, I think, than almost anyone else. Right now it's very voguish to be in the energy transition and be kind of working in investing in efficiency and clean materials and solar and all of these different things. Jonathan, you've been doing that since 2006, was it?
2007.
2007. So you've been there since the very start. So I'm kind of curious. Obviously, you've written this book, which is a fine kind of assessment of where we are now, the challenge we're faced with, and so on. But I want to, you've seen a few of these cycles already. How is this different, this moment we're in right now? Is there anything that gives you hope that the financial community is actually going to be able to address the challenges we're facing now?
Yeah, I mean, the book's called The Edge, and there's sort of two or three different aspects to that. One of which is that, in many ways, yes, 2022, I think, was one of the most important historical gear changes. Peter Frankopan earlier talked about looking out for a cardiac moment. Well, if you ever wanted to see a cardiac moment in the way that the way the world works, in the interface of materials and energy and geopolitics and climate, you could see that in 2022. So that's kind of the back end of my story. What I'm saying with The Edge is that we are literally pushing ourselves into a situation we might not have the materials for our long-term plan to solve the energy problem, or it might be incredibly expensive and geopolitically uncomfortable to get them. I'm pointing out that there are long-term historical trends which have now manifest themselves. Peter Frankopan also talked about his love for volcanoes, like expressing themselves like a volcano. 15 years of plus of geopolitical plate movements now all coming together in an explosion in Russia, Ukraine, when fighting over resources in the Middle East as an arena has now moved into Eastern Europe, and coterminously is starting to look like it might move into Arctic. So The Edge is really about, unfortunately, rather the end of history in a liberal environment, rather, I think, geopolitics driven largely by resource competition coming to a head. So that's one of the reasons I called it The Edge. The other one is that really, if for fun, the use of words, on the edge is literally the literal translation of Ukraine into English. It's on the edge of Russia. And we saw in 2022 fundamental political problem. Russia had spent with its European partners a lot of money trying to bypass Ukraine, which was the conduit for energy into Europe. It's a highway through Nord Stream 1. That was mothballed on the 22nd of February, and Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February. So the link between trying to get hold of distribution and energy resources is an edge which came to a head with Ukraine. The last point is a lot of these problems come out because through my experience over the last 15, 16 years of investing, all over the world, in America and Europe in particular, there's a cardiac moment which really hit me, which was, here we are, worried about energy, worried about materials, worried about commodities, food, water. And the astonishing economic and political reality which I've faced and tried to do something about is the fact that although we're competing for all of these resources, which is the subtitle of my book, and it's creating climate change and conflict, we're wasting most of them. And this is really the big matrix pill moment for me, or the cardiac moment, as Peter Frankopan might have said. You know, here we are, we're wasting about 3/4 of the world's energy, about half of the world's food, and about 1/3 of the world's water. And what an economic as well as political catastrophe that is. To be optimistic, what a fantastic opportunity to solve that problem if you can come up with answers and solutions. And that's also the reason I wrote my book.
What's kind of interesting with this juncture we're in at the moment, you mentioned the kind of prices and the cost of energy, is it feels to me that when people, you know, when the government committed to, in 2019 to getting to net zero, my understanding, you know, from talking to people within government and also outsiders, very few of them actually understand what we were committing to, so how we would get there. And I think what's interesting in this, like where we are now, is that a lot of the realities of what it will take to get there are starting to hit home. And my concern about that, and you can, you know, a lot of them are mapped out here in both of these books. How do we get there? It's not really about, you know, the climate question. It's about, okay, here's the goal. How do we get there? What's the engineering we have to do? You know, are we going to be able to make enough solar panels? If we're going to make enough solar panels, what does that need in terms of resources? And by the way, on that, you know, there's an interesting paradox here, because one of the things I tried to set out to do in this book was to try and tell the story with semiconductors. So basically, a semiconductor is made out of a silicon wafer. So too is a solar panel. They're made out of the same thing. It's still silicon technology. And one of the things I kind of wanted to do when I was writing this book, because, you know, I look at my phone all the time and I kind of idly wonder what it's made of. But no one I spoke to within the kind of world of silicon chips could explain to me, where does the silicon in your silicon chip actually come from? And I kind of went through this maddening search, talking to people within the semiconductor world, and like I say, it's the same for solar panels, talking to people within the silicon chip world, and they would know everything there was to know about how many transistors you needed on the chip to make it, you know, work on an iPhone. They'd know everything about the incredible science that it takes to etch these tiny, tiny, I was going to say microscopic, but it's beyond microscopic actually, because the size of transistors on the smartphone that you're holding or that you have in your pocket are so small they are smaller than the wavelength of visible light, which is something worth just kind of absorbing for a moment. Because I'm still absorbing it now, having kind of thought about this kind of, you know, having heard about this a few years ago. They're smaller than the wavelength of light. So in order to make them, by the way, you have to go through this extraordinary process where you're creating a type of light, extreme ultraviolet light, that doesn't exist in the world. It doesn't exist out there in the light that we see. You have to create that, and there's a crazy sci-fi way of actually developing that light. Well, anyway, I'll bore you with that a bit later on. But the whole point of this is that no one in that world, that sci-fi world, could explain to me where it began. They couldn't explain, you know, when you're touching a silicon chip or a solar panel, where that silicon actually comes from. And actually, I then discovered the process. The process is it comes out of a quarry. It gets blasted out of a quarry, you know, usually with some dynamite. It gets taken to a plant where that silicon is thrown into a furnace, an electric arc furnace, and melted at 1,500 degrees alongside wood chips and coal. So to make silicon chips and solar panels, you need coal, still today, the way we do it. And then after that, you go through, so then you end up with something called metallurgical silicon, looks like a metal. Then you have to go through another process where it's kind of melted down into something called polysilicon. Then you have to go through another process where the polysilicon is basically broken down again and turned into like this perfect, literally the most perfect thing that humankind has ever made. Incredibly perfect in chemical form. So basically, I think there's 1 in every 9 billion atoms is a kind of rogue other thing. It's the purest thing that humankind has ever made, and also the most ordered thing that humankind has ever made, because it's a perfect crystalline matrix thing. Each of those different processes involves a deployment of so much energy to get there. So much energy. And right now, a lot of that energy that is creating these amazing silicon chips is being produced via coal. And part of the reason that we are overwhelmed with lots of solar panels coming from China really cheaply is because they are deploying a lot of coal to do it. And that kind of raises this awkward question that, do we understand, in order to get to that promised land in 2050, what it involves to get there? And the answer is it involves lots more industrial deployment of energy and resources, and probably far more than we really appreciate. And what we're going through right now is that, to me, it seems like that kind of reckoning where suddenly we realize, hang on, so this is what we've signed up to. We all still agree on the goal, but only now are we starting to work out what it actually involves to get there. And that's because the politicians have only just started to work out what it takes to get there. And what we're going through right now with Rishi Sunak and all of this stuff about the 2030 and all of that is they don't really know what the ideal policy to do here is. And so I think this is quite a dangerous moment, because I think there probably will be a backlash against a lot of this. And I think that backlash derives from the fact that we signed up to something without really being clear about what the compromises and what the consequences of it would be. And so if we want to kind of get there, and if we want to be sane about how we get there, we need to understand the world that we inhabit right now and understand what it takes to get there. So I think that is really important, but I think it's quite dangerous at the moment, because I think there's likelihood of a backlash, in the coming years, because people will realize that things might get a bit more expensive before they get cheaper.
I think it's one of the reasons books like this are important, because I think it's critical, and I'm not sure there's enough of this. I think it's critical that in politics and in business, which is where most of this battle is going to be fought and lost, we'll come back to the home later. I don't think that this is about your homes, about dishwashers or electric vehicles, or particularly. I think this is more about politics and business and industry, because that's where 70% of energy gets used, and materials and the rest of it. But I think that the real problem, actually, really fundamentally, is do the decision makers in politics and business really understand how this is all working? And a great example of that, I often say, whether it's actually to media or politicians or to business, almost provocatively, well, we're wasting 70% of the world's energy. And some people say to me, oh, yeah. And then there'll be a letter or an email that comes back, maybe from an editor of the newspaper, saying, can you hold on a second? You said, what does that mean? How are we wasting 70% of energy? Unpack it. So your silicon wafer, I'll give the journey of a molecule. Give it partly because, shockingly, still 82% of the world's energy is oil, gas, and coal, just to dispel any feeling that the world runs on renewable energy, which it doesn't. If you take a molecule out of the ground to get it into the system, a pipeline, for example, if it's gas, which is most of the electricity generation and most heat, you lose about 10% just getting it in the pipe. That's just the extraction loss. When the molecule gets to an energy center, call it a power station, you lose at least 50%. And that's because thermodynamically, you cannot get a molecule into more than half a unit of electricity. The other half goes up as heat. And if you're generating energy away from the point of use, which is where most energy is generated in the countryside in large plants, you will lose that heat. It will just go off into space. It doesn't disappear, but it's not useful to you. So far you've lost, your molecule has lost 60%, roughly, a bit more, of its primary energy value. And then to get from the energy center to the point of use, buildings, industry, transport is 70% of energy use. It loses about another 10% again through transmission and distribution losses. So this is what's going on in energy, by the way, before it's even got to a building like this one. Sorry, this one's brilliant, but building like the ones in town where we all live in cities, where roughly 20-30% of the energy is lost because it don't use the right or best lights, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, insulation, the rest of it. So most energy is being lost. It's about 3/4 in the UK, in Europe, in the United States. If you want, the evidence is in my book, but it's also in the government's own publications here, the Digest for UK Energy Statistics, Dukes. It's been run since the 1970s in the United States. This is the way the world works. It's a centralized, very wasteful system. Sadly, the same is about the case for food. We waste about 50% of the world's food, and I'll come back to a story in 2 seconds on that one, and about 1/3 of the water. And if I just pick food and a journey that I point out in the book as well, you take a lot of people know about how inefficient it is to get food from the farm to the fork. I don't think I'm going to be saying anything surprising. Approximately 100% of food gets to your plate on fossil fuels. There really isn't any electric transport in that system. So stop oil, stop eating today. However, and by the way, it's packaged in plastic and shipped to you. However,
and made of fertilizer.
I was just about to come on to that.
Okay.
Ed, why didn't you tell the story? It's made of fertilizer. Fertilizer is, I think, Ed, you know as much about it as I do, one of the most extraordinarily inefficient processes. Fertilizer right now is made mostly from natural gas through a process which is called Haber-Bosch, which is responsible for us all being here. We wouldn't really run a 7 billion person planet without it. That's the good news. The bad news is it's incredibly inefficient. The best Haber-Bosch ammonia production facilities are about 50% efficient, meaning you put a natural gas molecule in, you'll only waste half of it. The more average ones are about 82% inefficient. So let's call it 70% of the embodied energy is typically lost before it gets into the fertilizer that gets put on the land. And then the devastating piece of this for me is that 70% of that typically evaporates off the land. So think about that from a cycle. You get the molecule, you get it, over 90% of it's lost before it gets the vegetables come out of the ground. The vegetables then get in the United States, typically on a plane and on trucks. They travel about 2,500 miles to get to the point of use. It's breathtaking. And somehow, over to you, Ed, somehow this isn't really the talking point of politics or environment discussions, but even of economics. You're the economics editor of Sky News, Ed. What on earth is going on in the economy if we're wasting most of the resource?
It's because, I mean, so I feel like, as someone who covers economics, that discipline is so completely disconnected from the other discipline of trying to think about the fate of the planet. And there have been efforts over the past few decades to try to bring those two things together. So economists talk about externalities. So they talk about carbon emissions as being a kind of externality, a form of pollution that affects other people that's not really accounted for. And that's why, economists are obsessed with the idea of a carbon tax, because it addresses the externality. But what economics is not especially good at is understanding the processes whereby, for instance, food comes to you. So we're really good at counting things like in GDP, how many items are sold. We're quite good at counting accounting for the prices that they're sold at. So that's basically what GDP is. We're quite good at measuring the rate at which prices change each year. That's inflation, as we all know. We're quite familiar with inflation right now, aren't we? We're not very good at kind of understanding the kind of a map of the economy that surrounds us. So we're not very good at understanding how food is transformed when it comes to us. We're not very good at understanding that it takes a big dollop of oil to get every bit of food to us, and finding a way to put that into our models. So economics is kind of, to me, has failed conceptually on this front. I think we need a better accounting of how the world actually works. We need better, what I call maps, showing those kind of connections. But at the moment, we have to work with the world that we're kind of in at the moment, and that world is one where we're scrambling towards some of these answers as we do the transition. We've set ourselves this incredibly ambitious target. We don't know entirely how we're going to get there, But the good news is that we are working it out. So there was this report from the International Energy Agency just out earlier this week. And one of the encouraging things that it shows is that right now, our carbon emissions, so right now, this is not just some theoretical thing off in the future. Right now, our carbon emissions as a planet, are significantly lower than were expected only a couple of years ago. And why are they significantly lower? It is almost entirely because there's more solar than people expected, because it's cheaper. Yeah, you can make a kind of point and a question mark about, are we too reliant on China? Are we too reliant on their coal? But still, there's good news. We've got more solar. There's fewer carbon emissions than people expected. There's more wind. There's more batteries. So technology is beginning to come to the rescue. And it's scrambling as fast as it can. It's scrambling in part because of finance corralled by the financial sector, partly thanks to people like Jonathan. But it is an extraordinary race. And I think the positive side of this, I think, so going back to the kind of economic thing, the thing that everyone in my world has been droning on about for years is, oh God, we're stuck in this secular stagnation trap. We're in this productivity mess. Productivity is too low. And that has been the big complaint within my field of economics for years. Well, you couldn't get a better opportunity to solve that than what we have right now. Obviously, there's things like AI as well, which are massively exciting for productivity, scary as well,
and
but exciting for productivity. But the energy transition, in trying to do this, we are trying to reimagine the scope and scale of pretty much everything we do as an economy. Like I say, this stuff underlies pretty much all of the activity we do every day. And we need to reimagine how to make everything. And that is a massive, massive challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity. So the following years, I think, could be some of the most exciting that any of us have lived through, because all of a sudden, innovation is happening. All of a sudden, we're having to reinvent things again. So there are lots of it's very tempting to see all of this and be quite doomsterish about it. And I, in the book, I kind of go from one side to the other, and if you read it, you'll probably find yourself doing the same thing as well. But amidst all of the challenge and all of the scary stuff, there are so many exciting opportunities that are not just kind of pie in the sky, that are real. And like I say, it's actually happening. It's happening. And that's amazing, to be living through all of this. We've had so much fear over the last 10, 20 years, both on the economy and on climate. Finally, there are some reasons to be hopeful. And that, to me, is kind of amazing and wonderful and something we should kind of celebrate.
Yeah, I agree with you on the optimism side. I think the challenge is trying to tie up how to prioritize and how to make sure that we don't end up spending a lot of money on things that might not happen or might not happen in time at enough scale. So, I mean, I think I completely agree with you on building solar power, wind, and the rest of it. I think the key feature, though, is to figure out how much time and cost it's going to take and plan what we do in the meantime. And I think that's one of the things as an investor. I run a company called Sustainable Development Capital. It's in our name. We would be naturally investing in wind and solar plants and everything else. But I think what's important is to understand the time and the cost associated with that and the challenge and the economics. The great news now, it wasn't the case when I set up my firm, is that it's cheaper to generate wind and solar than most conventional generation sources for power. The bigger challenge is, that's the good news, the bigger challenge is that power is quite a small proportion. You mentioned in here, in your book, electricity is the easy bit, actually, I think was the quote. But just to put it out into context, and this is slightly challenging, only 20% of the world's energy is electricity. Yeah. So almost all of the narrative in politics and business and finance has got to do with renewable power as a remedy to climate, security, whatever it might be. If it's not, it's a fantastically important part of the puzzle. It's critical, and frankly, I don't think we can do without it. But it's going to take a long time. And just to decarbonize electricity, to put it into context, the roughly $1 trillion stimulus package the US has got would decarbonize electricity in the US by 60% by 2030. But what happens to the rest of the 80% of the energy system, which isn't running on electricity? So it's a huge issue. But the reason I'm optimistic, Ed, actually is, yes, we're making progress on supplying new technologies. But actually, it's this cardiac moment, the matrix red pill, where you look at the world and you say, look, it's so inefficient. And it doesn't have to be. We don't have to be wasting 3/4 of the energy by generating it over here and using it over there. We can decentralize energy and bring it to the point of use with rooftop solar panels or cogeneration or recycling waste gases. That's what my firm has been doing for 16 years, and it works. So, by applying solutions, by looking at the world with the lens of efficiency, which is the E in EDGE, and decentralization, which is the D in EDGE, and generation of energy, which is the G and the E. By looking at these sorts of applications, we can actually cut costs, improve productivity, have these narrative discussions in politics about sacrificing the economy on the altar of the climate.
Yeah. Can I do two pessimistic things?
Yeah.
Because as a journalist now, I just want to be a contrarian and come up with the reasons for pessimism. Because there's loads of optimism, but so aside from, I think, the scale of that challenge, we are doing it at the same time as well, two big forces are pushing against us. The first is, well, it's China, in one word. We're at a moment now where we may be in a new Cold War, and trying to do this at the same time as the world cleaving apart and trying to make stuff ourselves within our own country rather than making them across the world, that's doubles, triples, makes it far, far, far more challenging. It just does. The economic logic of it makes it far more difficult. So if we're kind of trying to prise apart the world of the global economy as we know it, because it is so much more globalized than you can imagine. If you think about the smartphone, the silicon chip inside that smartphone, that has traveled around the world probably 4 times before it got to the fabrication plant where it was actually made. So again, we kind of underappreciate the scale of what's needed to create these objects, but also how much it kind of goes around the world. And if we're trying to tear that world apart politically, then that is pretty disastrous given there's not much time to waste. And the second issue that I get a little bit pessimistic about is there enough public will to go ahead with what will be one of the biggest building projects that we have ever done? If you look at what's happening in East Anglia at the moment, a lot of people are very upset about there being plans for lots of pylons that are going to go across the county. But it's hard to see, it would go across Norfolk and Suffolk. But it's hard to see how you can actually get the electricity. And like we're both saying, that's kind of the easy part. It's hard to see how you can build a grid without building lots more pylons. And so if there's public resistance to what we need to do, that's going to make this kind of awkward. And like building new mines, we need to build, I went to, in the course of writing the book, I went to this copper mine, biggest hole in the world. We need to build another 3 of the biggest holes in the world every year to satisfy the demand for copper that we need to go through the energy transition. And are we going to be okay with that? Technically, you could start digging up Cornwall. Because actually, by the way, the grades of copper in Cornwall are kind of pretty good, better in some cases than in Chile. But is everyone okay with that? I mean, probably not.
I think the challenge to the challenge is it comes back to the reason I wrote my book, because discovering it's not just that we need more. We do need more. There are more people. But actually, maybe the even bigger challenge and opportunity is that we waste so much. So we can, I think that at least as much effort needs to go into doing more with less.
Yes.
And I think this is the fundamental shift in mindset. If it's more with less, you don't need to waste 3/4 of the energy in this country. It's an economic catastrophe. It's an energy security catastrophe. The fact that that politics doesn't understand how the energy system works is the perfect example of that. Was last week's announcement around Rosebank, because it was described as an energy security policy. It's got nothing to do with energy security. It's an economic win for Scotland.
About that much difference in if the energy miners.
It will produce. This is the oil reserves discovered in Scotland. We're going to be exporting, but we'll export at least 80% of the oil, and the gas that comes out will last 3 weeks in the UK. So so why are we doing all of this? And I'm passionate about looking at applications that can do more with less. Why? Because I've been doing it. We've built a business at our firm that's connected to 55,000 buildings around the world. And we produce the same or better heating, cooling, power services, lighting, whatever it might be, using much less energy than the grid. That's the basic starting point. So I think this, you can extend it from energy into food and water, Ed, but this is the fundamental problem. I think we're not looking at the world with the lens of efficiency, which involves better, quicker, faster, cheaper.
Well, what's so good about Jonathan's book, I know we need to come to questions in a second, don't we? But what's so good about Jonathan's book in particular is a lot of people fixate on the big answers, the silver bullets. But actually so much of the work, so much of what we need to do is about the kind of unsexy stuff. So efficiency, that could be everything. It solves so many problems, but no one talks about it or champions it enough because it's not seen as sexy. It's not seen as a big bridge to anywhere or a big project or nuclear fusion or anything like that. But that's kind of where it matters. So that's why, you need to kind of talk to practitioners who actually work in the field, like Jonathan.
Yeah, and we will open up to questions. But I guess the last point I'd make on that is, I asked the questions about climate and energy security and cost at the beginning. I was actually really surprised about how almost everybody put their hand up on climate, because we're right in the middle of a culture war on climate that's hitting politics today. People running around with their hair on fire, worried about climate change on the one hand, or anti-ESG, anti-woke capitalism. I think a big part of the narrative coming into the UK and a part of what's going on in the US. But actually, I don't think you need to be worried about climate change to be interested in what we're talking about in the material world or edge. In fact, what does this look like without climate change? I'll put climate change back on this in a second. This is why it's so important to think about the material world and how that interacts with the energy system and everything we rely on. If we didn't have climate change, we would be having very substantial economic losses each year because of not just the opportunity cost of waste, but because of the way that the environment interacts with our economy. The reason China has made so much progress in the last 15 years is it calculated the impact of environmental degradation, factory closures, sandstorms, floods, public health risks on its GDP, and it was horrible, and they've done something about it. Health costs are a massive issue. Everybody talks about electric cars as if it's a climate factor. More people die in cities from premature lung disease from air pollution than they do from road traffic accidents. And that's really bad because more people die from road traffic accidents than they do from war, terrorism, and murder put together. So it's really not good. And then energy security is a big issue for this country as well. We're an island, we're an energy importer. The fact that these problems exist in the world, irrespective of whether you have an interest in climate change, I think are a huge call to action. Climate change added on, do we want it? Heat waves, drought, extreme precipitation, fire weather are the things that the UN has proven scientifically to be happening. We were worried about sea level rises, but I don't think you need to get too far into the future. I think this is about the present. And I'm just going to open up to questions from the audience. Yes, the yellow jersey.
Thanks. Ed, you were saying you expect a political backlash on energy in general. I kind of get that from the energy exploration point. Nobody wants a windmill in their garden or wants to pay too much for their energy. But I don't really get it for the energy efficiency point of view. I mean, that seems to me pretty common knowledge that you want to use less energy. Where does the political backlash comes from? And maybe also to you, Jonathan, saying what you're saying, that 70% of our energy is being spilled. Where does that political backlash come from? Because that feels to me like, as we say in Dutch, farmer's knowledge. It seems so logical to me.
I think limited time, but quick answer. As Ed described, I don't think it's bad. I don't think most people do things for well-meaning purposes. Our economy's been built and our energy system's been built on a supply-side centralised energy system, not by decentralised. So government, utilities putting out into energy and other services into the grid. So it's not a criticism so much of the political business system. It's more saying it's just not the way we've wired the world. And if we wire the world differently, I think we could do better. But I think there was a question right at the back by the door.
Thank you. I work in haulage, and why are we not talking about hydrogen? There's nothing wrong with the internal combustion engine. The problem is running internal combustion engines on the burning of dead dinosaurs. Nikola is a startup company in California. They run a 44-ton truck for 500 miles on hydrogen. Daimler are doing exactly the same, and the only emissions out of the tailpipe are water. Dr. Andrew Forrest, who's the second richest man in Australia, says that we are in an absolutely brilliant position in the UK to take advantage of creating green hydrogen. I'm from Lancashire, where we created the Industrial Revolution, and we've got a surfeit of wind and plenty of water. If we can create hydrogen, I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but that is going to be the answer, and the problem can be reduced to one word: infrastructure. And if Rishi Sunak could emphasise the infrastructure that we need, that would allow us to compete with Saudi Arabia, who are actually trying to create green hydrogen, and they don't have the water or the wind that we have. Thank you. I love your book.
It's a really good question. Hydrogen, potentially is a really important part of the mix, and I think there's a lot of people who dismiss it out of hand. I wouldn't, I'm no great expert on the thermodynamics here, but part of the challenge with hydrogen is it's incredibly inefficient to electrolyse it, and therefore just by going down that road, you're having to do so much work to get to the eventual fuel. Quick example of this: if you want to, and hydrogen answers a few other things as well, by the way, because you don't just put it into a kind of generator. You can also use it to make that fertilizer that we were talking about before. That's fantastic.
That's the biggest win on Earth.
However, here's the issue with hydrogen, and it doesn't mean we can't do it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it in the UK. And we've got lots of salt caverns as well, which is the other thing. We've got wind, we've got salt. You can store it in the salt. Not everyone has the salt. I've got lots more in the salt in the boat. But the point is, in order to make enough ammonia to basically compete with a pretty small plant in the UK that currently exists that makes that nitrogen, or did until recently, you would need, if you want to get it from green hydrogen, which is what you need to make that fertilizer, you would need the entire combined output of the world's biggest offshore wind farm, the one in Dogger Bank, just to provide hydrogen for that little fertilizer plant, and you're taking it away from lots of other people potentially. And so there's a massive energy cost to making the hydrogen, and we need to overcome that. And if we have energy plenty, then fantastic, but for the time being, everyone's looking at it and going, well, that's a big problem. So yeah, so there are some pluses, definitely some big pros to it, but some big question marks as well.
There's a young man in the audience in the front.
How can individuals make more with less in everyday life?
That's such a cool question. How can individuals do more with less in everyday life? I think everything that we can do in our everyday life can help. The good news, though, and I think I'm going to be in a short answer, is I don't think individuals need to worry about that so much. I think do everything right, turn your lights off, put on the best air conditioning systems you can at home, drive an electric mostly for pollution purposes. But let's put this question, young man, where it should go. The people that should be fixing this problem is the public sector, because they use 14% of all the energy in the country, industry, business, and the transport sector, like the gentleman at the back, because they're the white guys who are responsible for 70% of the world's energy, which is responsible for 80% of the man-made carbon emissions, which is responsible for a lot of the challenges we're facing today. And it can be done. And to pull it back to geopolitics and the espionage thing this morning, one of the fascinating things that the German energy minister said in figuring out what people could do about this back in 2014, the last time Russia invaded Ukraine, which was when it annexed Crimea, Oettinger, the European Commissioner, German, stood up and said, look, for every unit of natural gas we don't use, meaning business and industry and transport rather than homes, for every unit of natural gas we don't use is 2.5 units we don't have to buy from Russia. So the biggest thing that we can do is stop wasting our resources at political, government, at business and at transport level. That's where the big wins are. And I'm going to give an optimistic sigh of relief for everybody in this room. Direct your efforts and your energies, everybody, to putting that in the voting box, putting it in the media, putting it in the narrative, taking it back into your businesses, into public sector. If you work for the hospitals, tell them to change the light bulbs because they haven't, and that's stupid. And that will make the biggest difference. Put it back on the institutions and we can win. We're massively behind time, but I think I'm going to take one question from the lady in pink.
I'm wondering what your solutions and ideas are for Africa, which is the fastest growing continent. Context, I live in the wonderful kingdom of Cape Town where we have half a day of load shedding. And the cost of solar power is about 250,000 rand, which most people don't make in a lifetime, to put panels in a home. So, you know, what about Africa where most of our population are going to live? How are we going to, you know, provide solar power for them? How it just seems quite a daunting, depressing prospect.
It's a massive, massive issue, and I think you're absolutely right. That's where a lot of the energy and the thought needs to go when it comes to the coming years. Because do we want people, you know, to sacrifice their potential way of living and their opportunity to develop? And there's so much development, so much population growth across the continent of Africa. Do we want, you know, to be sending that message that people need to sacrifice in order to try to reduce carbon emissions? That's really tricky, and I think that's where the kind of the talks at COP need to go. Listen, we can talk about this more if you know you come and find us afterwards, because I've got kind of hours worth of talk I could do about that. But it's completely the issue. The fast-growing, big population areas. There's a lot of places, a lot of economists who talk about the idea of degrowth. Well, who's doing the degrowth? You know, is it us or is it the rest of the world? And if they don't really have a good answer for that. I worry that they think the rest of the world shouldn't be allowed to make the developments, lay the concrete, make the steel that they need to urbanize, to create high-speed rail, to have all of those kind of mod cons that we enjoy. So I do worry that there's this sense of other people needing to kind of sacrifice when we don't.
And don't sacrifice the good on the altar of the perfect. I think this is one of the most important pieces I'd have to say. You, young man, I can speak to you after. Can I answer the lady's question first? Why did I cut my butt at the edge? Don't sacrifice the good on the altar of the perfect. We need to use the resources that we've got as efficiently as we can. South Africa has relied historically on coal. Yeah. Currently, natural gas is a bit demonized, but if you could decentralize using the endowment that South Africa has, both in terms of its connectivity and its resources, from coal to gas, although it's not, I'm afraid, the number one popular thing to say, that has been a very important part of the energy transition. Just don't waste the heat coming from the gas. So decentralize, co-generate, and go through Ed's ladder on the energy transition and get from bad to less bad to good. And in due course, we can worry about the perfect. Okay. Thank you very much indeed for everybody.
Thank you.
And I'll ask questions.